my 3 weddings, their 3 funerals. Oh, the funerals. Like, he's clearly very glad they're gone, and you have to wonder, what are the odds of someone marrying 3 times and having all 3 wives die a natural death? Was there something more sinister involved here, perhaps? And that's never explained, and I don't think ever really delved into again, but it just gives us all the more reason to realize Mildew is a very, not just evil, but creepy character, and I think it's done very effectively. That wife gag comes back again when Hiccup is in Mildew's house trying to find the evidence. He sees portraits of those 3 wives. They're all very large, scowling Viking women. And then it gets weirder. There's 4 portraits, 3 wives and Fungus the sheep. As Hiccup says, wife, 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 sheep. Well, Mildew has a type. What's Hiccup implying that Mildew's doing with that poor sheep? And I'll just leave it there.
What's right is right, son.
This is the point of the podcast where I ask, what is the moral of the story? There seem to be 1 or 2 here, not really heavy-handed as they have been in some earlier episodes. When the morals of these first couple seasons worth of stories are stated directly, they tend to be stated either by Hiccup or by Stoic. Stoic because he's the father and he's trying to impart lessons to his son, especially about leadership and being a future chief. And Hiccup often because of things he's learned during the course of the episode or over his previous encounters with dragons. The first that Hiccup states is that you have to know who you can trust. And that is very important. It's a very important thing in all areas of life, whether dealing with people or dragons. And Hiccup knows he can trust the dragons. And he knows he can't trust Mildew, and that knowledge serves him well through this episode. He eventually finds the truth, even though at the end of the episode he can't prove it, which is another probably much more frustrating moral, that sometimes in life you will know the truth and you can't prove it. Sometimes you will be outsmarted by the bad guy, and I wish I had more comforting words to follow that, but I don't. It's just sometimes that's the way the world works, and one needs to learn to deal with it. A much less grim moral comes from Stoic when he's talking with Gobber about his decision to send the dragons off of Berk. He makes a comment that as a father he wants to do what's best for his son, but as a chief he has to do what's best for his village, and what's best for his village has to come first because it's a whole village, not just one person. He really wrestles with this. It hurts him to hurt Hiccup, but he knows, or at least he thinks at that point, he's doing the right thing for his village, and that is an important lesson about leadership. Sometimes when one is a leader, one has to put the feelings of an individual aside, and especially one's own feelings aside, to do what is good for the group. Of course, then you get into these very difficult situations of, well, does a leader consider the feelings of a minority over the majority, especially if that minority is oppressed or things like that? Those deep questions don't come into play here because he's really just talking about his relationship with Hiccup. And so it is still an important lesson in leadership.
Hey, I'm more woman than you'll ever be, sister.
Thank you, Ruff. And speaking of women, this is the point where I talk about the Bechdel test. Does this episode pass? Does this episode have 2 women with names who talk to each other about something other than a man? So in terms of the first criteria, 2 women with names, yes. We have Ruffnut and Astrid, as is true for most of the episodes. Second criterion is, do they talk to each other? Well, that one gets a little tricky because what counts as talking to each other? Do they have to be talking directly to each other, or can they be part of a larger conversation? And this is something that is hotly debated in Bechdel test websites and forums. What we have here is a couple of possible instances where the second and third criteria are passed. First one is definite. Astrid talks to this unnamed Viking woman at the door about dumb. So she's definitely talking to another woman. They're talking to each other about something, an organization, other than a man. So arguably the second criterion is passed, even though the 2 women having the conversation don't both have names. There are 2 group conversations where Astrid and Ruffnut are both active participants, but so are several guys, and so I don't know if that passes or not. One of them is when Hiccup is bringing up his idea of night patrol. So they're all talking about night patrol. They're not talking about a man. They're not really talking about any individual at all until Astrid insults Hiccup at the end. Both Roughnut and Astrid contribute to the conversation. Roughnut, as I've said before, requests permission to shoot first and ask questions later. The other conversations are when they're all talking about giving up their dragons and being sad about it, and they're not talking about men necessarily, they're talking about their dragons. So I'm not sure if those two conversations make it pass or not. I'm no Bechdel expert. The other potential pass comes with the question whether or not we consider the dragons people, and thus the female dragons women. Because, again, Astrid talks to Stormfly, says goodbye to her, and she squawks back in a very forlorn but loving way. I don't know if that would count either. I suppose the fact that I have to reach like this means that it probably violates the spirit of the Bechdel test, if not the letter. So I think I'm going to call this 2 out of 3 passed, because we do have 2 named female characters, 2 named women. 2 of the women, even though one is not named, do have a conversation with each other. If that woman that Astrid talks to about dumb would have had a name, we'd have a clear pass. However, we do not. So 2 out of 3, at least this time.
Science!
Trigger warning, the science section of the podcast today will involve discussions of car crashes, death by falling, and other potentially grisly topics. If you would like to skip over this, please jump to
45 minutes, 27 seconds.
Since this episode begins with Hiccup and Snotlout falling, the science I want to talk about in this episode is the science of falling. How often have you seen a character like Hiccup here falling from a great height, only to be caught just before they hit the ground and be completely okay? It's great drama, but it is just plain wrong. The old saying happens to be true: it's not the fall that kills you, it's the sudden stop at the bottom. As far as I can find, that's a quote from Douglas Adams, and he was right. This was put into precise mathematical language by our old friend Sir Isaac Newton. His second law says force equals mass times acceleration. Acceleration is simply the change in speed divided by the change in time. In other words, the force one experiences is simply how much mass you have times how much your speed changes, all divided by how much time that change takes. The more quickly you speed up or slow down, the greater your acceleration, and the more force and thus potential damage you experience. You have probably felt this in a car. If the driver stomps on the accelerator or slams on the brakes, causing a quick change in speed, you feel shoved forward or backward by the resulting force. Much less so if the car speeds up or slows down over a longer time. The actual injury from falling comes from the sudden change in speed, again called acceleration, at the end. All that really matters is how sudden that stop is. A famous example called out by Dr. Sheldon Cooper in an episode of The Big Bang Theory is when Lois Lane is saved by Superman after falling out of a helicopter in the first Christopher Reeve Superman movie. I'll let Dr. Cooper explain.
Lois Lane is falling, accelerating at an initial rate of 32 feet per second. Superman swoops down to save her by reaching out 2 arms of steel. Miss Lane, who is now traveling at approximately 120 miles an hour, hits them and is immediately sliced into 3 equal pieces.
Sheldon's right. Going from 120 miles per hour to 0, that suddenly would kill her, regardless of whether she's hitting Superman's arms or the pavement below. And yet in the film she's fine. This incorrect scenario is so common that it has its own page on tvtropes.org called, appropriately, Not the Fall That Kills You. Now, popular culture doesn't always get this wrong. Sometimes it is shown correctly. Probably the most famous example of it being shown correctly is the death of Gwen Stacy in the Spider-Man comic books. Professor James Kakalios of the University of Minnesota, my alma mater, has a nice video about this and has written a whole book on the physics of superheroes. I'll put a link to both in the description. I'll come back to Dr. Kakalios and poor Gwen in a bit, but at the moment all of this raises, I think, 3 important questions. 1. How much acceleration is safe? How much acceleration, sudden stopping or starting, can a person withstand without being injured or killed? 2. How do you save someone falling from a great height? What should have Spider-Man, or Superman for that matter, have done? And then 3, how physically accurate are Hiccup and Snotlout's falls, or more specifically, their landings in this particular episode of DreamWorks Dragons? So for the first question, how much acceleration is safe? Searching online for an answer to this is actually a little difficult, because one finds a lot of contradictory answers. Those answers are often put in terms of g-forces, or g's. 1g is simply the acceleration due to gravity at Earth's surface, which is the 32 feet per second that Sheldon mentioned earlier. In metric units, that's 9.8 meters per second squared. And all that means is that for every second of falling, neglecting air resistance for the moment, one gains 32 feet per second, or 9.8 meters per second, in speed. Starting from 0 after 1 second, Lois Lane's going 32 feet per second, after 2 seconds, 64 feet per second, after 3 seconds, 96 feet per second, and so on. So that is 1g. That is the acceleration Hiccup is experiencing as he is falling, and the force due to this acceleration is what we feel as our weight when sitting or standing on Earth. An acceleration in a car or a rocket or whatever that is twice that of gravity would be 2g's, 4 times is 4g's, etc. So if I weigh, say, 180 pounds on Earth, and I were to experience 2g's of acceleration, I would feel like I weigh 360 pounds. Or 4g's would make me feel like I weigh about 720 pounds. And you can see how this would get very uncomfortable and injurious at high g-forces. How many g-forces can a person withstand? As Wikipedia states, human tolerances depend on the magnitude of the gravitational force, the length of time it is applied, the direction it acts, the location of application, and the posture of the body. So in terms of, say, posture of the body, for example, astronauts are launched into space on their backs because that posture is the one in which the human body can best withstand these types of forces. The painful distinction of highest known g-force survived by a human being belongs to Kenny Brock. He was a race car driver severely injured, but not quite killed, in a 2003 crash at the Texas Motor Speedway. In that crash, according to sensors in the car, he survived 214 Gs of deceleration very briefly. The highest g-forces endured by a human without severe injury, depending on your definition of severe, was 42.6 Gs in a rocket flight experiment by John Paul Stapp, a man who contributed a great deal to aircraft and automotive safety with these experiments. He survived this acceleration with no permanent effects, though he was temporarily blinded. Professor Kakalios calculates Gwen Stacy's acceleration at about 10 Gs, which compared to what we've been talking about doesn't sound all that bad. However, remember what Wikipedia said, that the location of application is very important. In this case, 10 Gs applied to the whole body is very different than 10 Gs yanking on Gwen Stacy's neck, which is what she experienced and what was fatal. For any aspiring superheroes in the audience, what is the correct way to save someone falling from a great height? And the answer is given by Dr. Leonard Hofstadter in that same Big Bang Theory episode.
Unless Superman matches her speed and decelerates?
Right. Rather than stopping the falling person suddenly, the best way to save them is to slow them down as gradually as possible. This is actually why airbags, seatbelts, and crumple zones in cars save lives. Instead of being brought to a sudden and violent stop by the steering wheel or windshield, an airbag slows the passenger more gradually. We are still talking about a fraction of a second, but that is often the fraction of a second between life and death. Now, having established all of this, how realistic are Hiccup and Snotlout's landings? To calculate their accelerations, we need 2 pieces of information: how fast they were going initially, and how quickly they slowed down to 0 speed. When falling through the air, an object eventually reaches terminal speed, when the force of air resistance equals the force of gravity, and the object or person can't go any faster. For skydivers, this is usually quoted at about 120 miles an hour, which is exactly what Sheldon said earlier. Since Hiccup is fairly light, let's estimate his initial speed at a little slower of 100 miles an hour. How quickly did he lose all of that speed? I studied his landing frame by frame, but he is really blurry in the relevant frames, so the time from when he first touches Toothless's back to when he stops is not clear, in multiple senses. It appears to be at most 2 frames, which is 1/15 of a second. 100 miles an hour divided by 1/15 of a second yields about 68 Gs. That is, as we have seen, survivable in some circumstances, but not without injuries. Both Stapp and Brock were strapped into their vehicles in such a way as to maximize survivability and minimize injury. Hiccup, landing on his butt on a dragon's back, was not. So his enduring that kind of acceleration without any injury is not realistic. In fact, him surviving in that position might not be either. Then what about Snotlout? Since he's a larger, heavier person, let's assume he's falling at 120 miles an hour by the time Hookfang reaches him. Again, going frame by frame, the time from when Hookfang first contacts him to when they hit Mildew's roof is 67 frames, which is about 2.2 seconds. That gives us an average acceleration of 2.5 Gs, which is much more reasonable. It's actually less than what modern astronauts experience when being launched into orbit. In other words, Hookfang